You think you want to be a medieval knight? I get it. The armor gleams, the horses thunder, there's honor and chivalry. Let's begin with your training. You start young, around 7 years old, if you're lucky enough to be born with the right blood and the wrong expectations. Your noble father dumps you at another noble's hall, because no one wants to raise their own kids when they can outsource that misery. You're a page, now glorified servant, with a future in stabbing. You make beds, clean armor, learn Latin prayers you'll promptly forget once the killing starts. You might learn how to ride, if you survive the horses. War horses in the 13th century weren't docile hay-eaters. They were 2,000-pound slabs of muscle trained to kick, bite, and trample. Think angry medieval tanks with hooves. By 14, congratulations, you're a squire. Now you get to carry your lord's armor, sharpen his weapons, clean his chamber pot, and maybe, just maybe, learn how to use a sword without lopping off your own ear. Your job in battle? Stay behind your knight and don't die. Maybe retrieve his horse if it bolts. Maybe retrieve his guts if they bolt. Either way, don't embarrass anyone important. Now let's talk about the armor. Chainmail first. It's a 40-pound iron sweater that traps heat, restricts movement, and chafes in places you don't want to think about. By the late 14th century, you might get plate armor. Beautiful, articulated steel that costs more than a peasant village and fits like a medieval exoskeleton. Ever worn a steel corset during a heat wave? Imagine that, but with arrowheads zipping past your face and dysentery bubbling in your gut. Speaking of guts, the Code of Chivalry, that charming rulebook everyone forgets about 5 minutes into battle, was mostly theoretical. In practice, knights weren't noble paladins defending the weak. They were mounted predators with expensive gear and legal immunity. Froissart's chronicles are packed with tales of knights burning villages, looting churches, and cutting down peasants who couldn't run fast enough. Sir John Arundel in 1379 led a supposed crusade along the English coast. Instead, his men raped nuns, looted abbeys, and got smashed in taverns until their ship sank in a storm. God's judgment or poor seamanship? Bit of both. Then there's the battlefield. You think you're charging into glory. Really, you're riding into a meat grinder operated by people who haven't bathed since Michaelmas. Agincourt, 1415 classic nightly bloodbath. The French cavalry, loaded with pride and plate, charged straight into a muddy bottleneck flanked by English longbowmen. Horses slipped, men drowned in muck, and the arrows pierced through visor slits, eye sockets, groins. Not exactly a fairy tale ending. If you fall in battle and you're lucky, they ransom you. That's right, if you're rich enough, you're not a corpse, you're a walking banknote. A knight captured at Poitiers in 1356 might spend months eating stale bread in a rat-filled cellar while his family sells off estates to buy him back. If you're poor or annoying or just unlucky, no ransom, just a dagger to the throat and a quick burial under the mud. Now imagine surviving the war. You come home to a world that doesn't really care. Maybe you lost an eye. Maybe you cough up blood every winter. PTSD? No such thing. You're expected to host feasts, keep order, and maybe, if you're ambitious, enter a tournament. Ah yes, the tournament. Knightly sport, right? Sharif, your idea of a sport is legalized assault with a high chance of maiming. The melee was the main event. Not a joust, not a display. A full-scale team fight with blunt weapons and blurred rules. Chronicler William Fitzstephen described melees in 12th century London, where knights rushed together with a mighty crash, breaking lances and helmets. Broken limbs were expected. Death was common. One Flemish tournament in 1240 raised so much carnage that the Pope banned them for being schools for sin. Of course, bans don't stop knights. They just shift the violence sideways. You want to climb the social ladder? Great, get political. Join a retinue, kiss the right rings, offer your sword to whichever noble's feuding this month. In 14th century Italy, condottieri mercenary knights sold their loyalty like sausages. Sir John Hawkwood, English by birth, made a killing in Tuscany. Literally, he massacred entire towns for the Florentines, then switched sides for a better paycheck. Loyalty was a flexible concept when you had bills to pay. Bills, by the way, were constant. Armor needed repairing. Horses needed feeding. Pages needed beating. Tournaments required gifts, bribes, custom heraldry. A knight in Burgundy might spend a year's income on one event just to avoid public humiliation. The poor ones sank into debt. The desperate ones turned to extortion. By the late Middle Ages, knightly robbery was practically a genre. But perhaps you'd rather find glory in the Crusades, Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre, holy cities, unholy bloodbaths. The First Crusade opened with such spectacular carnage that one chronicler, Raymond of Aguilars, described soldiers wading in blood up to their ankles. Whether or not he was exaggerating, the intent was clear: salvation through slaughter. Knights saw the Levant as a holy playground. They raped, pillaged, and slaughtered with God's blessing, and a Templar cross stitched to their tunics. For penance, they just signed up for another round. You think chivalry had anything to say about this? Geraint said pray before battle and kill cleanly, then turned the page while knights roasted babies on spits during the sack of Béziers in 1209. The church called it purification. The survivors called it hell. Let's not forget knighthood's little brother heraldry, a fancy way to say, please don't kill me, I'm on your team. Coats of arms, banners, surcoats, sounds grand. But during real combat, mud, blood, and smoke turned it all into a swirling mess. At Crécy, English archers couldn't tell friend from foe. French knights killed their own in the confusion. So much for honor and clarity. And God help you if you didn't belong. Knightly status wasn't just about skill, it was about blood. Peasants could fight, bleed, die, but they could never be knights. When Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned alive in 1314, he didn't scream for his order. He screamed for justice. Fat lot of good it did him. Knights bled for the church, then got torched by it. Justice itself. Now there's a joke carved in Latin. If a knight murdered a peasant, he might pay a fine. If a peasant insulted a knight, he could lose a hand. Trial by combat was the preferred method of proving innocency, a process best described as God will sort it out with a sword. Win, and you're innocent. Lose, and you probably weren't innocent enough. This system only worked because it didn't. It was brutal theater dressed in plate mail. Even in peace, the knight's life didn't soften. You were a war machine in a world that never ran out of reasons to kill. In Scotland, border lords like the Douglases and Percys spent more time raiding each other than governing. In Bohemia, Hussite knights rode into battle on wagons armed with gunpowder, turning medieval chivalry into early industrial death. By the 15th century, knights had to learn to fight cannonballs. Good luck parrying that with a longsword. And yet the image persisted. The knight in shining armor, defender of the weak, patron of damsels and dragons. But the truth is, most knights wouldn't recognize a dragon if it bit them in the codpiece. Their dragons were human angry peasants, rival lords, creditors, wives with daggers and memories. Take Ulrich von Liechtenstein, a 13th century knight who, dressed as Venus, rode across Europe in drag and challenged men to duels for love. You think that's romantic? His autobiography reads like a medieval fever dream wrapped in narcissism and scented with rosewater. He filed his teeth, for God's sake. That wasn't courtly love, it was a crisis with a budget. In the end, being a knight wasn't about honor, it was about survival. Holding land meant defending it. Defending it meant blood. Killing wasn't a crime, it was currency. Chivalry didn't protect the innocent. It protected the powerful from consequences. The sword was never just a weapon. It was a license. So, could you survive as a medieval knight? You could train until your muscles scream, ride until your thighs bleed, pray until your knees give out. But the real test isn't strength, it's stomach. Can you watch your friend get his face caved in by a flanged mace and keep swinging? Can you walk into a burning town, past screaming mothers and hacked corpses, and call it justice? Because that's what it took. Not glory, not grace. Just the ability to keep going when everything inside you says, stop. And here's the final sting. That shining armor, It wasn't for battle. It was for display. The most ornate suits, the kind we see in museums, with etched filigree and gold inlay, were made for parades and funerals, pageants for men already broken. In the end, the knight didn't survive the Middle Ages. He performed them. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're still alive. And that's already better than most. But now comes the part they never show in the painting's maintenance. Knights weren't just warriors. They were landlords, lawmen, diplomats, and debt collectors. Your sword gets you land, but land gets you headaches. Serfs to manage, taxes to extract, borders to defend, and rivals to humiliate. Chivalry doesn't mow your fields. It doesn't keep your neighbors from poisoning your well. Let's drop you in rural Normandy, around the year 1272. You're a landed knight, no chevalier Terrien. You've got a little manor, a grim-faced wife you married for acreage, and a dozen peasants who hate your guts but fear your dogs. You think you'll live well. You won't. Your castle is a drafty stone rectangle that leaks when it rains and stinks when it doesn't. The food is coarse, the beer is flat, the fleas are loyal. Justice? That's your job now. You run the local court from your hall, where you decide if a man stole a pig or if a woman practiced witchcraft or just backtalked her husband. In some places, you still use ordeal by water. Tie the accused, throw them into a pond, and wait. If they float, they're guilty because water, being pure, rejects them. If they sink, they're innocent. You haul out the corpse and call it divine proof. Legal brilliance, really. You might be thinking, well, at least there's the church. Spiritual guidance. Maybe some peace. Wrong again. Your priest is likely the younger son of another noble family, half-literate, overworked, and hiding a mistress in the next village. The church doesn't offer peace. It offers taxes. The tithe 10% of everything. Wheat, cheese, eggs, even your honey. Don't want to pay? Congratulations, you're excommunicated. That means no sacraments, no marriage, no burial, and no friends. You're socially dead, spiritually toxic. The medieval version of being banned from all social media, only worse because it ends with your corpse rotting in a ditch. And still, the wars don't stop. You thought knighthood was a season? It's a climate. Every spring brings a fresh border skirmish, a new rebellion, or some king's wet dream of expansion. You're expected to show up. Bring your armor, bring your retainers, bring your loyalty. Don't ask questions. Don't count bodies. Just ride. Sometimes the enemy's foreign. Sometimes it's your own peasants. Enter the Jacquerie, northern France, 1358. Picture this. The Black Death just swept through Europe, killing 1 in 3. The 100 Years' War is draining France like a stuck pig. The nobles lose battles, burn towns, then retreat to their fortresses to demand higher taxes. One day, the peasants snap. Thousands of them, armed with scythes, flails, whatever they can, rise up and start slaughtering knights. They storm manors, kill families, strip noble women naked, roast them alive, and dance around the fires. The knightly response? Worse. Charles the Bades, that's his real title, leads a retaliatory purge so vicious it makes the original rebellion look like a picnic. The roads of Picardy run red with blood. One chronicler, Jean de Venette, wrote that all the roads were covered with corpses. But sure, tell me again about honor. By now, you might be wondering, where's the romance? The courtly love? The minstrels with lutes and ladies with veils? All right, let's talk about love. Courtly love was a literary invention, emphasis on literary. In practice, noble women were married off young, usually to older men with money and gout. If they were lucky, they got a husband who bathed. If not, they got marital rape and childbirth roulette. Love was something you performed through poetry and gestures, not something you experienced. A knight might wear a lady's favor at a joust, but that didn't stop him from chasing serving girls or beating his wife. The Count of Anjou once celebrated his wedding by sending his new bride home and inviting prostitutes to his victory feast. A real romantic. As for poetry, most knights couldn't even write. Literacy wasn't a given, it was a gamble. If you were lucky, you learned enough Latin to curse a monk. But the songs of the troubadours weren't written by knights. They were written by professionals, court performers, spin doctors in tights. They painted the knight as a noble lover because someone had to. Now let's shift south to Spain. The Reconquista. Centuries of holy war, half crusade, half colonial expansion. Knights here are different. Hardened by desert warfare, armored in mail and religious fervor. The Order of Calatrava, for instance, took vows of chastity, obedience, and eternal war against the Moors. Spoiler, they weren't great at chastity. Their castles doubled as brothels within a generation. Inquisition records are full of knights confessing to sex, theft, blasphemy, and occasionally goat-related crimes we won't unpack here. Still think the knight was a paragon? Let me introduce you to Bertrand du Guesclin. Born ugly, poor, and mean in Brittany, he rose through the ranks not by charm but by slaughter. He fought in the 100 Years' War, tortured prisoners, extorted cities, and died with the title Constable of France. His nickname? The Black Dog of Brocéliande. Even his enemies admitted he was brilliant, terrifying, a knight for the apocalypse. Du Guesclin wasn't unique. He was the rule. Knights were brutal because the world was. You didn't survive by being good. You survived by being effective. Killing with grace didn't win you land. Killing efficiently did. But maybe you'd rather stay home, serve your king directly, become a knight of the realm. Well then, welcome to the royal court, a nest of sycophants, snakes, and softly whispered accusations. Everyone smiles. Everyone lies. If you slip, even once, you're toast. Knights who got too close to power often ended up closer to the gallows. Sir Piers Gaveston, Edward II's favorite, was dragged from a castle and beheaded by jealous nobles. No trial, just steel. Paranoia was baked into the job. You wore armor not just on the battlefield, but in the banquet hall. In 13th century England, some knights refused to remove their swords at court because accidents happened. Cups got poisoned, daggers got drawn. Better to eat with one hand and keep the other on your hilt. Still want to try the joust? Fine, mount up. You're in the lists. Trumpets blare. Ladies scream. You lower your lance. Your opponent does the same. And then, impact. The force of a charging warhorse slams through your shoulder. You hear your clavicle crack like dry wood. Your helmet rings. You taste blood. If your lance shatters wrong, a shard might pierce your throat. It happened to King Henry II of France. Died with a splinter in his brain. Good times. And if you win, a purse of silver, a few cheers, and chronic pain for the rest of your life. The crowd cheers. You throw up in your helmet. Heroic, isn't it? You think knights rode for glory, but most rode for survival, for rent, for revenge, for reasons that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with hunger, literal and political. The myth of knighthood is clean. The reality was caked in blood, mud, and legal ambiguity. By the late 15th century, gunpowder had begun to make armor obsolete. Muskets ignored chivalry. Cannons laughed at walls. A peasant with a matchlock could drop a knight in full plate from 50 paces. No lance, no lineage, just bang, and you're meat. So what did the knight become? A costume, a relic, a walking contradiction. And yet somehow, the image lived on. It wormed its way into stories and songs and state propaganda. Monarchs held onto it because it made conquest look noble. Writers praised it because reality didn't sell poems. The knight, that brutal, broken figure, was polished until he shined. But underneath the gleam, he still stank of rot. Shall we go deeper? There's one more layer left, and it gets worse. Let's peel back the last layer then. Not the armor. The idea of the knight. The thing they whispered about at night when the fire burned low and the blood hadn't washed out of the tunic yet. Because here's the cruel truth. No one writes into the ballads. Knights weren't heroes. They were a system. A human mechanism designed to channel violence into hierarchy. A class of professional killers romanticized only after they became obsolete. You didn't become a knight to protect the weak. You became a knight, so you didn't become the weak. And that system? It had teeth? Ever hear of chevauchés? These weren't battles. These were strategic burnings. A knight, under orders, would ride into enemy territory, often during truce periods, and light everything on fire. Barns, mills, fields, livestock, churches if no one was watching. It was economic warfare. You don't fight the army, you starve the army's children. Edward the Black Prince, poster boy of English knighthood, perfected it in France. In 1355, his forces marched from Bordeaux to Narbonne, torching over 500 towns. Chroniclers noted the countryside bristled with flames. They called it brilliant strategy. The peasants called it the end of the world. So what does a knight do when there's no war to fight, no tournament to enter, no more peasants to tax? You still have weapons, you still have debts, and you still have expectations, yours and your lineages. Some knights turned pirate, literally. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Order's cast-offs became freelance raiders. In Ireland, English knights ran private feuds against rival clans, burning crops in spring, kneecapping messengers in summer, baptizing children in stolen blood by autumn. The law couldn't stop them. The law was them. Others became executioners in all but name. In Italy, condottieri like Alberico da Barbiano made slaughter a subscription service. Pay up and he protects your city. Miss a payment, and you wake up to fire in the streets and horses in your chapel. One Milanese chronicler described the aftermath of a nightly raid as rivers of ash, with arms and faces poking through. That wasn't a metaphor. That was Tuesday. And those tournaments you loved so much, they got faker. By the late 15th century, jousts were rigged like wrestling matches. Elaborate sets, rehearsed passes, choreographed falls. The armor glittered, but the meaning was gone. Like everything that dies, knighthood got theatrical. You want the final joke? Even the church couldn't clean it. They tried. My God, did they try. Orders of warrior monks sprang up like mushrooms. The Templars, the Hospitallers, the Knights of Santiago. Men sworn to chastity, poverty, obedience, and industrial-scale violence. Their rules read like monastic gospels, but their actions read like war logs. Take the Templars. Supposedly holy. In practice, one of the richest organizations in Europe. They ran banking networks, owned fleets, and lent money to kings. And when Philip IV of France needed cash and scapegoats, he had them arrested, tortured, and burned. Their confessions, extracted with hot irons and crushed bones, included heresy, sodomy, and devil worship. Were they guilty? Doesn't matter. The world didn't want knights with money and secrets. It wanted their land. So, after 200 years of crusading, sword-kissing, vow-breaking, and empire-building, the knight was cooked, not killed. That would have been merciful. Just slowly, methodically digested by the state and the market. The Renaissance arrived, gunpowder boomed, and the knight became wallpaper, an aesthetic, something to slap on your family crest and lie about at dinner parties. They started showing up in paintings, looking serene and noble, cradling lances like crucifixes. You'd never guess that their forebears had carved out borderlands with fire and flails. But still people missed them. Not the real ones. No one missed the tooth rot, or the trauma, or the piles of children orphaned by tournament accidents. But the idea? That stuck. The knight as protector, as paragon, as proof that violence could be noble. You see it in Victorian novels, in propaganda posters, in fantasy games. Hell, you see it in every political speech that talks about defending values with force. That's the knight, echoing through time, sanitized, defanged, wearing a new coat of paint. But ask a chronicler and honest on, and they'll tell you, a knight was someone who killed, and was paid for it, who lived in mud, died in metal, and prayed to a god that didn't always pick sides. And the world they built? It's still here, just in different armor. So, could you survive life as a medieval knight? Wrong question. Could you live with yourself afterward?